The moment your wife starts scheduling your place in her life like a business appointment, your marriage is already in trouble. I didn't realize that until the night Olivia looked up from her phone and calmly informed me that she would now decide when we talked, when we spent time together, and that I needed to stop chasing her. There was no shouting, no argument, no dramatic scene straight out of a movie. Somehow that made it worse. The living room was quiet except for the low hum of the air conditioner and the faint sound of traffic drifting through the windows. A lamp in the corner cast a warm yellow glow across the hardwood floor. Olivia sat at the opposite end of the couch scrolling through her phone while I held 2 mugs of coffee I had just made. It was a Thursday night in early October. Outside, the leaves were beginning to turn. Inside, something far more important was changing. My name is Nathan Brooks. I'm 47 years old. I live in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. For nearly 2 decades, I believed I was a good husband. Not perfect, just dependable. The kind of man who showed up. The kind who remembered anniversaries, paid bills on time, fixed leaking faucets before they became problems, and spent Saturday mornings mowing the lawn while listening to classic rock through old earbuds. I thought that was enough. Maybe it wasn't. Or maybe it had never been the problem in the first place. Olivia didn't look angry when she said those words. That's the detail that stayed with me. Her voice was calm, casual, almost bored, like she was explaining a new household rule. From now on, she said without looking away from her screen, I'll decide when we talk or spend time together. You need to stop chasing me. I remember standing there holding those coffee mugs. One for me, one for her. The steam curled upward between us like a ghost. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misheard her. 17 years of marriage, and that sentence didn't sound real. It sounded like something a stranger would say. Someone passing through my life. Not the woman whose last name matched mine. Not the woman whose pictures filled our hallway walls. Not the woman I had spent nearly half my life building a future beside. I set the mugs down on the coffee table. My first instinct was to ask what she meant. My second instinct was to defend myself. To explain that wanting to spend time with your wife wasn't chasing. That asking someone how their day went wasn't a crime. That trying to stay connected wasn't weakness. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the look on her face. Maybe it was the exhaustion I had been carrying for years without admitting it. Or maybe it was the realization that this conversation wasn't actually beginning tonight. It had started a long time ago. Tonight was simply the first time someone said it out loud. Olivia finally glanced up. Her expression never changed. I'm serious, Nathan. I need space. I need freedom. I don't want to feel pressured every time you ask me to do something together. Freedom. The word landed harder than I expected. Because I hadn't been asking for anything extraordinary. A dinner. A walk around the neighborhood. A movie on Friday night. Small things. Ordinary things. The kind of things married couples used to do without keeping score. Yet somehow, over the years, those simple requests had become negotiations. Then inconveniences. Then burdens. And now, apparently, violations. I sat down across from her. The cushions shifted beneath my weight. The house felt strangely large all of a sudden. Too quiet. Too empty. I looked around at everything we had spent years building. Family photos. Vacation souvenirs. A framed picture from our 20th anniversary trip hanging above the fireplace. Evidence of a life that looked solid from the outside. But foundations can crack long before anyone notices. Looking back now, I think the most painful part wasn't what Olivia said. It was how little it surprised me. Because somewhere deep down, I already knew things had been slipping away. The canceled plans. The distracted conversations. The evenings spent sitting in the same room while feeling miles apart. Little fractures. Tiny warning signs. The kind people ignore because acknowledging them feels too frightening. Olivia returned her attention to her phone. The conversation was already over as far as she was concerned. But for me, something had just begun. I stared at the dark television screen across the room and saw my reflection staring back. Tired eyes. Gray creeping into my beard. A man who had spent years trying harder every time he felt someone pulling away. A man who believed effort could fix distance. A man who suddenly realized he might have been running a race alone. And as the silence settled around us, one thought entered my mind with a clarity that terrified me. If Olivia wanted to live as though she didn't need me, maybe it was finally time to find out what life looked like when I stopped trying to convince her otherwise. The strange thing about carrying a marriage on your back for years is that you do not notice how heavy it has become until you finally stop walking. That night, after Olivia went upstairs, I stayed in the living room long after the coffee had gone cold. The clock above the fireplace ticked steadily through the silence. 11:15, 11:30, midnight. I sat there staring at a life I had spent 17 years building and wondered when exactly it had started feeling like a job instead of a partnership. People like to talk about major turning points. They imagine dramatic betrayals or explosive arguments. My story was different. It was built from thousands of ordinary moments. Small sacrifices, quiet compromises, tiny decisions made over years that slowly became the foundation of someone else's comfort. I met Olivia when I was 30 years old. Back then, I worked 6 days a week managing operations for a regional logistics company outside Columbus. The hours were long. The pay was decent. The future was uncertain. We rented a small apartment with outdated carpet and a furnace that rattled every time winter rolled through Ohio. We did not have much money. Most Friday nights consisted of takeout pizza and old movies because that was what our budget allowed. Yet somehow those years felt richer than the ones that came later. We were building something together. At least that was what I believed. When our first mortgage was approved, I remember standing in the driveway holding a ring of new keys while Olivia wrapped her arms around me. The house was nothing special. 3 bedrooms, a small backyard, a cracked concrete patio that needed replacing. To us, it felt like a castle. I spent weekends repainting rooms, installing shelves, repairing things I could barely afford to replace. Every improvement felt like an investment in our future. Every late night at work felt worth it because it moved us one step closer to stability. Over time, my career grew. Promotions came. Responsibilities increased. The paychecks got larger. The hours got longer too. There were years when 60-hour workweeks became normal. There were holidays interrupted by conference calls. Vacations shortened because clients needed something. I told myself that was what responsible husbands did. They carried the load. They protected the future. They made sure the people they loved never had to worry about the bills. Looking back, I can see how easy it became to measure my value by what I provided. If something broke, I fixed it. If money was tight, I worked more. If stress entered the house, I absorbed it. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking what I needed and focused entirely on what everyone else needed from me. The strange part is that I never felt resentful. Not then. Every sacrifice seemed reasonable when viewed one at a time. Missing a weekend trip because of work. Skipping golf outings with friends. Turning down opportunities to travel. Postponing hobbies. Delaying personal goals. None of it felt significant in the moment. Years later, those small decisions had accumulated into an entire lifestyle. Olivia's life gradually expanded while mine quietly narrowed. She joined social groups, started attending networking events, took weekend trips with friends, filled her calendar with activities and commitments. I encouraged all of it. I wanted her to be happy. I wanted her to have opportunities one never gave myself. The irony is that the more freedom I created for her, the less room seemed to remain for me. At some point, our conversation shifted. We stopped talking about dreams and started discussing schedules. We stopped sharing experiences and started coordinating responsibilities. Little by little, I became part of the infrastructure of her life rather than an active participant in it. The house stayed beautiful. The bills stayed paid. The routines stayed intact. From the outside, everything looked successful. But success can be deceptive. Sometimes it hides problems instead of solving them. Sitting alone in that living room, I thought about every extra shift, every postponed plan, every promise that things would slow down someday. I had spent years believing I was investing in us. For the first time, I wondered whether I had simply been making withdrawals from myself. And as the darkness settled against the windows and the rest of the house slept, I realized something uncomfortable. Olivia's words had hurt because they exposed a truth I had avoided for years. I had built my entire identity around being needed. The question waiting for me now was simple. If I stopped chasing approval, attention, and validation, who exactly was Nathan Brooks when nobody needed anything from him at all? Once you start looking back honestly, the signs become impossible to ignore. The problem was not that they appeared overnight. The problem was that they arrived so slowly I learned to live with them. Human beings can adapt to almost anything, including loneliness inside their own marriage. During the weeks that followed, I found myself replaying moments I had dismissed for years. Small moments, ordinary moments, the kind nobody talks about because they seem too insignificant to matter. Yet when enough of them pile together, they tell a story. Friday nights used to belong to us. At least they had in the beginning. Somewhere along the way, those evenings became optional, then negotiable, then unavailable. I would suggest dinner and hear that she was exhausted. I would suggest a movie and learn she already had plans. Sometimes the plans involved friends. Sometimes networking events. Sometimes a yoga retreat, a workshop, a fundraiser, or some other commitment that somehow appeared without warning. I remember standing in the kitchen one evening holding 2 tickets to a concert I had purchased months earlier. Olivia glanced at them and sighed like I had handed her an obligation instead of an invitation. "I completely forgot about that," she said while typing on her phone. "I already told Melissa I would go with her." The tickets sat on the counter for days before I finally threw them away. It was not about the money. It was about what they represented. Another small disappointment added to a growing collection. Then there were the conversations. Or rather, the lack of them. We still spoke every day. People would have seen us talking and assumed everything was fine. The problem was that our conversations had become entirely transactional. Grocery lists, appointment reminders, household logistics. Information moved between us, but connection did not. Some nights I would ask how her day went and receive a one-word answer. Then she would disappear into her phone while I sat across from her at the dinner table wondering how 2 people could occupy the same room and still feel so far apart. One memory stayed with me more than the others. About 8 months before that conversation in the living room, we attended a neighborhood barbecue. The summer air smelled like charcoal and freshly cut grass. Children ran through sprinklers while adults stood around coolers filled with ice and soda. At one point, someone asked how Olivia and I had met. It should have been an easy question, a simple story we had told 100 times. Instead, Olivia laughed and said, "Honestly, I think Nathan wanted to marry me way more than I wanted to marry him." Everyone chuckled politely. I smiled too. That is what husbands do. They smile so nobody feels uncomfortable. But I remember driving home later that night with the radio off and the windows down, wondering why the comment bothered me so much. Looking back, I think it hurt because there was truth hiding inside the joke. The pattern repeated itself everywhere. Family gatherings, social events, holidays. I became the reliable background character in my own marriage. The man who carried chairs into the backyard. The man who loaded coolers into the truck. The man who remembered birthdays and sent cards and showed up early to help. Useful, dependable, predictable. The problem with being predictable is that people eventually stop noticing the effort behind it. They begin treating it like weather, something that simply exists, something guaranteed. The hardest part was realizing how often I made excuses for behavior that would have concerned me if I saw it happening to someone else. Every canceled plan had an explanation. Every distant response had a reason. Every disappointment came with a justification. I became an expert at translating neglect into temporary stress. I convinced myself things would improve once work settled down, once life became less busy, once the next season arrived. But seasons kept changing and nothing else did. One evening, about 3 years earlier, I had surprised Olivia by leaving work early. I picked up her favorite takeout from a restaurant downtown and drove home thinking we might spend the evening together. The house was dark when I arrived. A note sat on the kitchen island. Went out with friends. Back later. No call. No conversation. No mention of the plans beforehand. I ate alone at the table while the food cooled beneath the kitchen lights. At the time, I told myself it was not a big deal. The truth was that it felt exactly like a big deal. I had simply become too accustomed to disappointment to admit it. Sitting in my home now, with all those memories lining up one after another, I could finally see the picture they created. None of those moments destroyed a marriage by themselves. Together, they revealed something far more troubling. Olivia had slowly stopped treating my presence as something valuable. And the most painful realization of all was that I had spent years helping her do it by accepting every excuse and every dismissal without ever questioning what it was costing me. The decision itself did not feel dramatic. There was no grand speech, no slammed doors, no moment where I announced a new chapter of my life. The truth is that most important decisions happen quietly. They happen when nobody is watching. They happen in ordinary moments that look insignificant from the outside. 3 days after that conversation in the living room, I woke up at 5:30 in the morning like I always did. The house was dark. A cold October rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. I stood at the counter drinking coffee while the coffee maker clicked behind me. Normally, I would have sent Olivia a text sometime during the day. Something simple. Hope your meeting goes well. Drive safe. Let me know if you want dinner tonight. Small messages. Small efforts. Small reminders that someone was thinking about her. That morning I did not send anything. Not because I was angry. Not because I was trying to punish her. I simply stopped. The realization surprised me. For years I had treated every growing distance between us as a problem that required more effort from me. More communication. More patience. More understanding. More sacrifice. But what if effort was not the answer? What if I had been pouring water into a bucket with a hole in the bottom? The thought followed me through the day. By lunchtime I noticed something strange. I felt lighter. Not happier. Just lighter. Like I had set down a bag I had been carrying for so long that I forgot it was there. That evening I came home, cooked myself dinner, and ate at the kitchen table. Olivia arrived nearly an hour later. Normally, I would have asked about her day, asked whether she wanted something to eat, asked whether she was tired. Instead, I simply nodded when she walked in. She looked at me briefly before heading upstairs. The interaction lasted less than 10 seconds. Yet something felt different. The next few days followed the same pattern. I stopped initiating conversations. I stopped asking for plans. I stopped suggesting date nights. I stopped checking whether she was available on weekends. At first, nothing happened. Olivia seemed completely unaffected. That hurt more than I expected. Part of me had assumed she would notice immediately. Part of me thought she might ask if something was wrong. She did neither. Life continued exactly as before. That was when I learned another uncomfortable truth. Sometimes people become so accustomed to receiving attention that they stop noticing it entirely until it disappears. A week passed. Then another. The leaves outside turned orange and gold. The mornings grew colder. Every day, I kept waiting for some reaction. Every day, I received none. Yet beneath the disappointment, something else was beginning to grow. Space. For the first time in years, I had free mental energy. Energy that was no longer consumed by analyzing Olivia's moods or wondering how to reconnect. One Saturday morning, I found myself driving to a state park about 30 miles outside Columbus. I had not been hiking in nearly a decade. The trails wound through forests painted with autumn colors. Fallen leaves crunched beneath my boots. The air smelled clean, sharp, alive. I walked for nearly 2 hours without checking my phone once. Standing beside a small lake surrounded by trees, I felt something I had not experienced in years. Peace. Real peace. Not the temporary relief that comes from avoiding conflict. Not the exhaustion that follows surrender. Peace. The kind that arrives when your attention finally returns to your own life. When I got home that afternoon, Olivia was sitting on the patio scrolling through her phone. She looked up as I walked past carrying my backpack. "Where were you?" she asked. It was the first personal question she had asked me in weeks. I paused for a moment. "Out hiking," I said. "Oh, that was all. No follow-up questions. No interest. No curiosity." Yet as I continued toward the house, I noticed something in her expression. Confusion. Small. Fleeting. Barely visible. But it was there. For years, she had always known exactly where my attention would be focused. For the first time, she had no idea what I had done with my day. That evening, sitting alone in the den while rain tapped softly against the windows, I realized my experiment had already begun. I had spent 17 years trying to pull someone closer. Now I was doing nothing at all. And for the first time in a very long time, I was curious to see what would happen next. The first sign appeared on a Tuesday evening. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just a small crack in a pattern that had existed for years. I had started stopping at a local gym after work 3 times a week. Nothing extreme. 45 minutes on a treadmill. A little weight training. Enough to clear my head before driving home. That particular night, I walked through the front door around 7:30 carrying a gym bag instead of a briefcase. Olivia was standing in the kitchen pouring herself a glass of sparkling water. For a second, she simply stared at me. "You are late," she said. I almost laughed at the irony. For years I had been the one wondering where she was. Now she was asking about me. "Stopped somewhere after work," I replied. Not rude. Not defensive. Just factual. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Where?" The question hung in the air. I could have answered immediately. Instead, I took my time hanging up my jacket. "The gym." She nodded slowly. "Since when do you go to the gym?" It was such a simple question, yet it revealed everything. "Since when?" since I stopped spending every spare minute trying to maintain a connection with someone who no longer seemed interested in having one. Of course, I did not say that. I simply shrugged. A few weeks now. She looked surprised, genuinely surprised, as though entire sections of my life had started happening without her permission. The conversation ended there, but I noticed something had changed. Over the following week, similar moments began appearing. Small questions, casual observations, tiny interruptions in the routine. One Saturday morning, I left early to meet an old friend named Mark for breakfast. Mark and I had worked together years earlier before his company relocated. We had not seen each other in almost 4 years. The diner smelled like coffee and bacon. The booths were worn. The coffee mugs were chipped around the edges. It was perfect. We spent nearly 2 hours talking about careers, families, aging parents, and all the ordinary realities of middle age. When I got home around 11, Olivia was sitting on the patio with her laptop. She glanced up immediately. "Where did you go?" she asked. Again, another question. Another moment of curiosity. "Breakfast? With who?" "Mark." She looked confused. "Mark from Cincinnati? That is the one. I did not know you still talked to him." Neither did I thought. Not because I had lost interest in my friendships. Because somewhere along the way I had stopped making room for them. The funny thing about reclaiming your own life is that it starts attracting attention from people who assumed it would always revolve around them. By the 3rd week, the shift became harder to ignore. Olivia began entering rooms and finding me occupied, reading, working out, listening to podcasts, planning weekend activities. She would stand there for a second longer than necessary before continuing whatever she had been doing. One evening, she walked into the den while I was researching hiking trails for a trip I wanted to take before winter arrived. "What are you looking at?" she asked. "A state park near Hocking Hills." "Why?" "Thinking about spending a weekend there." She stared at the screen. "With who?" I looked up. "Maybe by myself." That answer seemed to bother her more than I expected. Not because she wanted to come, because the idea had never crossed her mind. For years, my plans had revolved around accommodating everyone else. Suddenly, there were plans that existed independently of her. The biggest surprise, however, was not Olivia's reaction. It was mine. Every time she asked a question, part of me expected old habits to return. The urge to explain, to seek approval, to make sure she was comfortable. Instead, I found myself remaining calm. Not cold, not angry, just calm. There is a difference. For the first time in years, my emotional weather was no longer controlled by someone else's attention. And somewhere beneath Olivia's growing curiosity, I began noticing something else. A subtle discomfort. The kind people experience when a familiar system stops operating the way it always has. She was not upset because I was doing anything wrong. She was unsettled because the version of Nathan Brooks she had grown accustomed to was quietly disappearing, one ordinary day at a time. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. It was not something Olivia said. It was something I finally understood. One cold November morning, I was sitting alone in a coffee shop before work. The windows were fogged from the difference between the warm air inside and the freezing temperatures outside. People shuffled past carrying coats and travel mugs while soft music played through hidden speakers overhead. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when I found myself replaying the past few months. Not the arguments, not the disappointments, the pattern. For years I had assumed the problem was distance. I thought if I communicated better, tried harder, became more patient, somehow the connection would return. But sitting there watching strangers come and go, I realized I had been solving the wrong problem. Olivia never seemed particularly interested when I gave her attention freely. Yet the moment that attention became less available, her curiosity increased. The realization unsettled me. Not because it made me angry, because it explained far more than I wanted it to. Over the following days, I started noticing things I had missed before. If I spent an evening quietly reading, Olivia would eventually appear in the room. If I left early for a workout, she would ask where I was going. If I mentioned plans for the weekend, she suddenly wanted details. The strange part was that none of these interactions felt like genuine interest in my life. They felt more like someone checking whether a familiar piece of furniture had been moved. One Thursday evening, I was reviewing some work reports in the den when Olivia stepped into the doorway, holding a glass of wine. She stood there for a few seconds before speaking. "You seem different lately." I looked up from my laptop. "Different how?" She shrugged. "I do not know. You are just different." A few months earlier, that comment would have sent me searching for reassurance. I would have immediately asked whether everything was okay, whether she was unhappy, whether I had done something wrong. Instead, I simply smiled. Maybe I am. She looked disappointed by the answer, not because it was rude, because it gave her nothing to work with. That was when another piece of the puzzle fell into place. For years, our dynamic had followed an unspoken script. I pursued. She responded when she felt like it. I adjusted. She controlled the pace. I worked harder whenever distance appeared. She never had to wonder where my attention was because it was always available, always waiting, always predictable. Without realizing it, I had built a system where my effort carried the entire emotional weight of the relationship. Once that effort stopped, the imbalance became visible. A week later, we attended a dinner party hosted by friends from the neighborhood. The dining room was crowded with couples balancing paper plates and glasses of wine. Laughter echoed across the room while football played quietly on a television in the background. At one point, the conversation turned toward hobbies and weekend plans. A friend asked what I had been doing lately. Before I could answer, Olivia jumped in. Apparently, he spends all his time hiking now. People laughed politely. Apparently, one woman asked. Olivia smiled awkwardly. Well, he is always off doing something these days. The comment was meant as a joke, but it landed differently than she intended. For years, I had quietly adjusted my schedule around hers. Nobody noticed because sacrifice rarely attracts attention. The moment I started creating my own plans, however, it became noticeable. On the drive home that night, rain tapped softly against the windshield while headlights streaked across wet pavement. Olivia stared out the passenger window longer than usual. Finally, she spoke. You really have changed. This time, there was no humor in her voice. I kept my eyes on the road. Maybe I finally stopped changing myself. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Because deep down, I think we both understood the truth. The version of me that had spent years chasing approval was disappearing. And for the first time since our marriage began drifting apart, I was beginning to understand that the problem had never been whether Olivia valued my attention. The problem was that I had spent so long giving it away that I forgot to value it myself. By December, the shift had become impossible to ignore. The house looked the same. The routines looked the same. From the outside, nothing had changed. Yet underneath the surface, the entire dynamic of our marriage was quietly rearranging itself. The difference was not what I was doing. The difference was what I had stopped doing. I no longer monitored Olivia's moods. I no longer adjusted every plan around her availability. I no longer spent my evenings trying to create conversations that she clearly did not want to have. That energy had gone elsewhere, into my health, into friendships, into hobbies I had abandoned years earlier, into building a life that existed whether she participated in it or not. What surprised me most was how quickly other people noticed. The annual holiday gathering at our neighbor Greg's house arrived a week before Christmas. Every year, the same families showed up carrying casseroles, desserts, and bottles of wine. The smell of cinnamon and baked cookies filled the air. Christmas music played softly through ceiling speakers while children raced through the hallways wearing ugly holiday sweaters. For years, events like this followed a familiar script. Olivia mingled effortlessly while I floated in the background making small talk and helping clean up whenever something needed to be done. This year felt different from the moment we walked through the door. Several people greeted me before greeting Olivia. Mark had recently introduced me to a local hiking group, and a few members happened to be attending the party. Before long, I found myself standing in a conversation about weekend trips, photography, and travel plans for the spring. I was laughing more than I had in years. Not because I was trying to prove anything, because I was genuinely enjoying myself. At one point, I glanced across the room and noticed Olivia watching from near the kitchen island. The expression on her face caught me off guard. She did not look angry. She looked uncertain, almost as though she was seeing someone she thought she already knew. Later that evening, one of the women in our neighborhood smiled and asked me about a hiking trail I had mentioned online. Before I could answer, Olivia interrupted. Nathan is always busy lately, she said with a laugh that sounded forced. I practically need an appointment to see him. A few people chuckled. The comment was meant to be playful, but nobody seemed quite sure how to respond. For a brief second, the room fell into an awkward silence. Then someone changed the subject and the conversation moved on. Yet I noticed something important. Olivia had attempted to tell a story about me that no longer matched reality. The old version of Nathan Brooks would have immediately reassured her. I would have smiled and explained that she came first, that I was always available, that nothing had changed. Instead, I simply continued talking with the group. I did not correct her. I did not defend myself. I did not participate in the joke. For the first time, I allowed the moment to stand exactly as it was. The drive home was quiet. Snow flurries drifted across the windshield beneath the glow of streetlights. Olivia stared out the passenger window while Christmas songs played softly through the speakers. Finally, she broke the silence. People seem to enjoy being around you lately. I almost smiled. It was such an unusual observation. I hope so, I replied. She looked at me. You know what I mean. I did. The comment was not really about other people. It was about control. For years, she had occupied the center of our social world. Without realizing it, she had grown accustomed to being the gravitational force around which everything else moved. Now the orbit was changing. Back at home, she lingered in the kitchen while I made tea. Normally, she would have headed upstairs immediately. Instead, she stayed. You have been spending a lot of time away from home, she said. Her voice was calm, but something beneath it felt different. Not really, I replied. Just doing things I enjoy. She folded her arms. You never used to. That statement stayed with me long after the conversation ended. You never used to. She was right. I never used to. I used to spend every available moment trying to earn connection from someone who offered it only on her terms. I used to believe devotion meant shrinking parts of myself to make room for someone else. I used to think sacrifice automatically created appreciation. Standing there beneath the warm kitchen lights while snow collected quietly outside the windows, I realized something else had changed. Olivia was no longer reacting to my absence. She was reacting to my independence. And for the first time since this journey began, I had a feeling that the questions she was asking herself were becoming far more uncomfortable than any questions she had ever asked me. The conversation happened on a Sunday night in January. Outside, snow covered the neighborhood in a blanket of white. The streetlights reflected off the frozen sidewalks, casting pale gold shadows across the front yard. Inside, the house was quiet except for the faint hum of the furnace pushing warm air through the vents. I had spent most of the afternoon organizing photos from a recent hiking trip. Olivia had been upstairs for hours. We had crossed paths a few times during the day, exchanging polite comments about groceries and household errands. Nothing more. Around 9 o'clock, I was sitting in the den reading when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Olivia appeared in the doorway. Something about her expression immediately caught my attention. She looked nervous. Not angry. Not irritated. Nervous. It was a look I had not seen in a very long time. She stood there for a moment before speaking. Do you have a minute? For years I would have dropped everything the second she asked. This time I simply closed the book and nodded. Sure. She stepped into the room and sat across from me. Neither of us spoke right away. The silence felt different from the silence we had shared over the past several months. This one carried weight. It carried intention. Finally, she looked down at her hands. I feel like we have been drifting apart. The words settled between us. For a moment, I simply listened. Months earlier, hearing that sentence would have filled me with relief, validation, hope. I had spent years trying to discuss exactly that issue. Now that it was finally being acknowledged, I felt strangely calm. Not because I did not care, because I had already spent enough time grieving what was happening. Olivia looked up. Do you not see it? She asked quietly. I took a slow breath. I do. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, as though she expected agreement to solve something. But neither of us continued speaking. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. Somewhere upstairs, the ice maker dropped a fresh batch of cubes into the freezer bin. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet everything felt unusually sharp. Olivia shifted in her chair. You barely talk to me anymore. The irony nearly made me smile. Not out of cruelty. Out of disbelief. I remembered all the evenings spent trying to start conversations that went nowhere. All the invitations declined. All the attempts ignored. Yet I kept my voice steady. I talk when there is something to say. Her eyes narrowed slightly. That is not fair. Fair. Another interesting word. I stared at the snow-covered backyard through the window beside us. Months ago, I probably would have defended myself, listed examples, presented evidence, explained every reason behind every change. Instead, I found myself asking a simple question. What exactly feels unfair? Olivia hesitated. For the first time in years, she seemed uncertain of her footing. You are different, she finally said. You used to make more of an effort. The room grew quiet again. There it was, the sentence that explained everything. Not because it was malicious, because it was honest. Effort. That was what she missed. Not necessarily me. The effort. The constant pursuit. The endless availability. The certainty that no matter how distant she became, I would continue moving toward her. I looked at her carefully. The woman sitting across from me was not a villain. She was not cruel. She was simply confronting a reality she never expected to face. For years, my attention had been a permanent fixture in her life. Now it was no longer automatic. "Olivia," I said softly, "do you remember that conversation we had back in October?" Her expression tightened immediately. She knew exactly which conversation I meant. "Yes." I nodded slowly. "You told me that you wanted to decide when we talked. When we spent time together. You told me to stop chasing you." The silence that followed felt endless. Olivia looked away first. Her gaze drifted toward the dark window. "I did not mean it like that," she whispered. I believed she meant those words. The problem was that intentions and consequences are not always the same thing. I leaned back in my chair. My voice remained calm. Calm enough that even I surprised myself. "Maybe not. But those were your words." Her eyes returned to mine. For the first time all evening, I saw something break through the confidence she usually carried. Regret. Real regret. The kind that arrives long after a decision has already changed everything. And as we sat there surrounded by silence and winter darkness, I realized something important. This was no longer a conversation about distance. It was a conversation about consequences. Because sometimes the hardest thing a person can experience is watching someone finally accept the role they were assigned and discovering they never wanted them to accept it at all. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. There were no ultimatums, no grand declarations, no sudden transformation that fixed everything overnight. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, there was something far more difficult. Honesty. The conversation that began on that winter evening continued in small pieces over the following months. Sometimes over morning coffee, sometimes during quiet dinners, sometimes while sitting together in a living room that had spent too many years holding silence. Olivia started asking questions she had never asked before. Questions about my hikes, my plans, my thoughts. At first, I was cautious, not because I wanted revenge, because trust, once neglected, does not instantly return. It grows the same way it fades. Slowly, one decision at a time, one conversation at a time, one act of effort at a time. For the first time in years, I stopped measuring the relationship by promises and started measuring it by actions. And to Olivia's credit, the actions began to change. She initiated conversations. She suggested dinners. She started showing interest in parts of my life that she had ignored for years. Not perfectly, not consistently, but genuinely. The difference mattered. One Saturday afternoon in early spring, nearly 6 months after everything changed, we found ourselves sitting on the back patio. The air was warm. The trees were turning green again. A pair of robins hopped through the grass searching for worms while a gentle breeze moved through the neighborhood. We sat quietly for a while before Olivia finally spoke. "I think I took you for granted." The words were simple. There was no dramatic speech attached to them. No elaborate explanation. Just the truth. I stared out across the yard and nodded. "I think I let you." That answer surprised both of us. Because the reality was not as simple as one person being wrong and the other being right. Relationships are rarely that clean. Olivia had grown comfortable receiving effort without returning enough of it. I had grown comfortable giving effort without requiring respect for it. We had both participated in the same unhealthy pattern. The difference was that one of us finally stopped playing the role we had been assigned. Looking back now, I do not see those months as the period when I lost something. I see them as the period when I recovered something. Myself. The version of Nathan Brooks that existed before he confused self-sacrifice with self-worth. Before he believed love meant making himself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. Before he forgot that respect is not something you earn by chasing harder. It is something that must exist on both sides. Olivia and I did not magically become the perfect couple. No marriage works that way. What changed was the foundation. We stopped operating from assumptions and started operating from honesty. And if there is one lesson I learned through all of this, it is that people often do not realize the value of something when it is endlessly available. Not because they are evil, not because they are cruel, because human beings naturally adapt to whatever becomes constant. The moment we stop valuing ourselves, we quietly teach others to do the same. Standing in that backyard months later, watching the sun sink behind the trees, I realized something that would have sounded impossible a year earlier. I was grateful for the moment everything changed. Not because it was easy, because it forced me to become someone stronger, healthier, and more honest than I had been before. And maybe that is the real ending to this story. Not who won, not who lost, but what happened when one person finally decided to stop chasing and started walking beside his own life again. I would love to know what you think. Have you ever seen a relationship change after someone stopped taking the other person for granted? And if you enjoyed this story and want to hear more real-life relationship journeys like this one, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next story. Sometimes the quietest lessons leave the deepest mark.